Good morning. Welcome to day 2, I guess, of the FileMaker 2017 Developer Conference. I'm excited to be talking to you today about FileMaker calculation fundamentals. And just before I get into it, I want to say that if you were in my session yesterday, who was in my session yesterday? Anybody here? Okay, good. A number of people. There are going to be some things from my session yesterday that you're going to recognize again today because they're not only were they central to understanding relationships, which was yesterday's session, but they're also central to understanding the way that calculations work within FileMaker. And so I'm glad that you've heard a couple of these things, really just a couple of these things, once before. It'll give you something to grab onto and something that you'll be familiar with and give you a sense of feeling comfortable with this material, I hope. The other thing that I want to say is that I'm hoping that not everything that you see today is going to be 100% new to you. Hoping that some of this you're going to have a little bit of familiarity with, and it's just going to be a quick review for you. That way you've got a mental model in place, more or less, just a little bit even. Anybody, put up your hand if you have used calculations in FileMaker before. You've just given it a whirl. Just give it a try and just fool around. Okay, so most people, for the people that haven't, that's okay because we are really going to start at ground zero. We're going to start at a very fundamental level, and we're going to build up from there fairly quickly. So a little bit about me. My name's Doug Gardner. My company is Exoteric, a Toronto-based FileMaker consultancy. I've got clients across Canada and the United States. We're FileMaker Platinum partners. And we've been developing databases for about 23 years now. My view, as I said yesterday and as I like to say, is anti-authoritarian. It's not me standing up here as the authority telling you the way that it is, although there's a chance that I've been around the block a little bit more frequently than you have in the FileMaker world. And so I'm hoping that you're going to learn things from me, but at the same time, I want you to be critical of the things that I'm saying and the way in which I'm presenting them to you. And let me know, let me hear it. If there's something that you disagree with, or you think I'm on the wrong track, or I'm not explaining it well, or whatever it might be, let me know. We won't have the opportunity to really have a dialogue here because there are too many people in the room. You can come up to me afterwards, find me in the halls. I would love to talk to you about any of these things, or really anything having to do with FileMaker. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to begin by showing you a basic calculation in FileMaker, talking about the calculation window a little bit in FileMaker, and then we are going to go on a tour of FileMaker and see most of the places where calculations can be used, and just talk a little bit about how they can be used in those places. Whoops. Okay. I've got a sorry, there's something wrong with my demo here. I know what it is. Just give me one sec. We're going to create a field in the database. And the way that we do that, of course, is by going up to File, choosing Manage Database. And then here we've got a list of all of our tables. I think most of you are probably familiar with that. Within tables, we have fields. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new field, which I'm going to call Calculation Example. Like this. And I'm going to go over here and define it as type calculation. So one of the ways in which FileMaker uses calculations is by actually defining fields as a calculation. So we're going to start at the very most fundamental level, define a field as a calculation, and then say OK. Oops. Sorry, say create. And then first thing FileMaker does is it asks me to define the calculation. Well, I'm not going to do that yet. I'm going to close it down. I'm going to put the field on the layout, field that we just created using the field picker. And I'm going to just drag it out, put it on the layout here to get started. Now, let's go back in. I showed you how to get into the calculation window the first time. From here on, I'm going to be using the shortcuts. So if we look up here and we see File, Manage, Manage Database, we can see that it's Shift Command D on the Mac, and it's Shift Control D on Windows. That's how you just jump in there fast. And the more you use FileMaker, the more you get used to using these shortcuts. If you're smart, I know people that have worked in the FileMaker world for years and years and haven't really learned the shortcuts. And believe me, they're wasting a lot of time by not doing that. So let's go in to our fields. Here's the field we just created called Calculation Example. I'm going to double click on it to open it up, and where we are able to define the calculation for this field. So this is FileMaker's calculation window. I'm going to show you a few things about it here really quickly. First of all, down the left-hand side, we see all of the fields in our current table. We can select any of those fields to bring them into a calculation. We can also see fields from other related tables in our database. And we can bring fields from related tables into a calculation as well. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute. Over on the other side, over here, we have a list of functions within FileMaker. And FileMaker we can view them as by type so that they're grouped, and there's a little disclosure triangle, and we can click and we can see there are all of our text formatting functions, for instance. Here are all of our text functions just for manipulating text. If we look through, there's all sorts of different types here: financial, trigonometric, logical, get. We're going to talk about what the get functions are in a few minutes. A whole bunch of different types, and the best way to really become familiar with all of the functions in FileMaker, I'm going to display them in a different way here, all functions by name. And when we do that, we can see that we scroll through, well, it's not like there's just a few here. There are way too many to remember. But it's very useful, not just for people that are new to FileMaker, but for people that have been around FileMaker for a long time, to go into the Help menu. FileMaker has a Help menu right up here, and choose FileMaker Help, and you can get a list of all of the functions in the reference area of FileMaker's Help. And I highly recommend just reading through the list. It will give you the name of the function and tell you what it does. Read through those every once in a while so that you've got in the back of your head that it's possible to do something. You don't have to remember exactly how the function works, because when you go into the Help menu, it will explain the function in detail and show you how it works. But if you just know something's possible, then you're on your way to solving a problem. If you don't know it's possible, then I see again and again people doing things in very awkward ways just because they weren't aware that there was something very straightforward that was already built within FileMaker. So that holds for calculations and also for scripts. Read through the list of script steps, and just there's a brief one-sentence explanation of what they do. Just read through that every once in a while. Have it in your head. I've been working in FileMaker for over 20 years. I still do that. Okay. In addition to having our functions and our fields, in this great big window here, we can type in a number of different things in order to create an expression. Expression is also known as a formula. And FileMaker formulas can be really simple, like 1 plus 3. So if we just use pure math in this window, FileMaker knows what we're doing, and it will just return the result. Here, I'm going to get this window set up a little bit better here. So there we go, 1 plus 3, and it shows us the result is 4. Now, in addition to that, though, and by the way, when we enter a 1 and a 3 with nothing around it, just all on its own, that's called literal text, or it's also called it's also called a I'm forgetting. Anybody want to help me? It's in addition to it being called literal value, it's also called a, God, I'm not remembering the term. Anyway, I'll come back to it. I'll think of it. FileMaker can accept different sorts of values that we enter directly. So if, for instance, I wanted to put the word Bob in here and just have Bob show up in that field that I had just created, well, there are a couple of reasons that this isn't going to work. One is when I go to close my window, FileMaker is going to say, hey, wait a minute, the specified field can't be found. Why does it think that it's a field? Well, the reason is because it's because FileMaker does not see any quotation marks around this, and which would indicate to FileMaker that I'm trying to enter some literal text. I'm putting a text value in. And so FileMaker looks through the list of fields over on the left side and says, is there a field that's named Bob? No, there isn't. And so I don't know what to do with this. This has no meaning to me. As soon as I put quotation marks around it, now I've said, OK, this is a piece of, why can't I remember the term? Anyway, it's a single value piece of literal text that we're defining. And when I close the window, that shows up in my calculation field down here. So we can put in literal text. We can also drag data in from our fields over on the left side. Notice down here at the bottom now, it says calculation result is number. What I entered was not actually a number. It was a word. FileMaker, behind the scenes, though, is storing that value as a number. It's using its Unicode value. Every character in the alphabet has a Unicode value. It's using that code value, and rather than displaying the Unicode value, it is displaying it as text just as a quirk of the way that FileMaker works. We could force it to display the Unicode value. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But if we say text, that our value is text, then FileMaker is storing the value as text, and it is treating it as text for the purposes of indexing it. We're going to talk about indexing a little bit later. So let's create a calculation using some text values. In my database here, let me just show you a couple of things. I've got a couple of fields. First name field and a last name field, Bob and Barker. Well, suppose we want to put these together so that in our text example, we've got Bob and Barker together. Well, to do that, we're not taking the literal text Bob and entering it in our field. We're taking the value that's in the current or in the field on the current layout. We're going to put that into our calculation. So there's the first name that we've entered right now. And if I close this, you would see that it said Bob in the field. But I'm not going to close it yet because I want to add Barker to Bob. And in order to do that, we have to understand a few things about operators in FileMaker. See this little thin strip that's going down the right side of the screen? Well, these are FileMaker's operators, and they are used for putting pieces of text together in different, or putting values in expressions together in different ways. So I showed you a quotation mark, and I told you that if we want to have a a piece of text that we define inside of the calculation, it's got to be inside of quotation marks unless it's a number. Otherwise, FileMaker doesn't know how to handle it. So I want Bob and I want Barker. Well, if I just put a first name and a last name field together like this, and then I try to close my window, it's going to say, wait a minute, we can't find the field that's named name underscore first, name underscore last. Well, there is no field named that. But there is a field named name first, and there's a field named name last. And we have to tell FileMaker that we are going to put these two things together. To do that, we go over to our operators that are running down this side, and we've got a few options. We could put the ampersand in between them. We could put plus in between them. We could use the word and in between them. Only one of these will produce the correct result. And in order to understand this, you have to know that these that all of these operators have specific functions. The first block right here, where we've got quotation marks, brackets, the ampersand, and the carriage return, these are all text operators. So that gives you a clue. If we want to put two pieces of text, Bob and Barker, together, we need our text operator right here, which is the and symbol. And so I'm going to just click on it over here. And now we've got first name and last name. And when we close this window, FileMaker is going to accept this. But I want to say a couple of other things about operators down here. So why couldn't we use the plus symbol? Well, we can't use the plus symbol because that's a mathematical operator. That's only for putting two numbers together or expressions that will result in numbers together. Down here we've got and. That's a logical and. So if we want to say this is true and this is true, therefore the whole is true, we use this. We can also have or, we can have not. So it's not the case that this expression is true. XOR means one side or the other is true, but not both are true at the same time. And we've got our symbols for putting together all of our comparative operators as well, like equals, not equals, greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than, and equal to, etc. OK, so now we've put together our first name and our last name. I'm going to close the window down, and I'm going to show you. So now we've got our calculation, Bob Barker, but really we want a space in between there. We have to tell FileMaker to put the space in there. So that requires us to go in, look at our operators. We can't just put a space in, because FileMaker actually ignores spaces that are typed in. If we close the window right now, it's going to look at the exact same as it did before, Bob and Barker right together like this. FileMaker ignores all these spaces unless we put our spaces into quotation marks. And so now we've got a literal value, and our literal value is space. So Bob and space, and if we try to close it, womp, womp, it's saying, hey, you need something else. You need an operator. And the operator that you need, in this case, of course, is another ampersand, because that's what we use to concatenate pieces of text. We put that together, close it, and there we go, Bob Barker, just as we expected. Now, let's talk a little bit about the functions now within FileMaker. So I'm going back into this field, and looking down the left side, you can see we've got a bunch of different functions along here. Well, what is a function? A function is a named, predefined formula that takes some values in and it turns something back out. So I'm going to give you an example. There is a function right here called day name. And I'm going to move that function into the calculation window. By the way, FileMaker changed in the last version, not the current version, but in FileMaker 15, so that you can just go like this and start typing, and it will autocomplete. It makes entering functions and calculation very, very quick and easy. So in this particular function, it's called day name. What it does is it takes in a date, and it returns the name of the day in the week. The value that it takes in is called a parameter. So a parameter is just a value that we pass into a function. And it could be a constant, which is the word that I was trying to think of earlier when I was talking about, in addition to calling it literal text, we also call any value that we specify directly, like putting a 1 in or a 12 in, or putting something into quotation marks like Bob. That's a text. That's a constant within our calculation. So this is looking for text that is a date. And there are a couple of ways that we can do that. We could, first of all, we could enter today's date. Anybody what's today's date? It's the 26th, so I'm going to enter 07/26/2017. I'm going to put that in. So I've now created my text constant, and the day name is going to evaluate this and tell us that it's a Wednesday. Well, there are other ways that we can do this. We can give this function, suppose we want the current date, today's date, and we don't know what date we're going to be using this on, so we can't enter the date literally in here as a constant, but instead we want it to change with whatever the date happens to be. Well, there's another function in FileMaker. FileMaker's got a whole list of functions here that are called get functions. You might want to look at these. There's a long list of them. They allow you to get things from your current environment, from the computer that you're using, or from the database that you're currently using, and pull them into a calculation. There's a huge number of these things, like get the active field name, so the name of the field that I'm currently clicked in. Get the account name, so when I log into the database, it can pull my account name out and use that in a calculation. Allows me to, say, get the privilege set name that I'm currently using, et cetera, et cetera. All kinds of different things that we can pull out of our FileMaker environment and bring them into a calculation. The interesting thing is there's one that's called get current date. And get current date just gets whatever the date is today. And tomorrow it'll be getting the current date, which will be tomorrow's date, et cetera, et cetera. So I can take this and pass this in as a parameter. So one function becomes a parameter that gets passed into another function, like that. Day name, get current date. And there we go. Still Wednesday, but interesting thing about dates in FileMaker, and by the way, as it stands right now, I'm saying that the current result is text. That's because we're not returning to this a date. We're just returning to it text, the name of a date. Okay? If you know the way that dates are stored in FileMaker, you can perform calculations with dates. Turns out that the current date is just the number of days since January the 1st, 0001. And so under the hood, FileMaker is storing each day as just a number counting up from 0001. The second day from January 1st in the year 1 is day 2. Then the next day is day 3, day 4. Well, we're up, I don't know where we are right now. Actually, we can find out easily enough. But I'm going to show you something. I can now put a calculation in here and say, okay, give me the current date plus 1 and show me the day name for that. There we go. We get tomorrow's date. So knowing the way that dates are stored allows us to perform calculations with dates. I'm going to talk to you about how other types of values are stored in FileMaker so you can see how to do calculations with those as well. One last thing that I want to say is when you're looking at all of the get functions that we were looking at here, they're a little bit different than all of our other functions. Remember, our dayname function was looking for a date as a parameter. But our get functions all of our get functions, they don't take parameters. The parameter is actually implicit. It's implied. It comes from FileMaker itself, from the current environment that you're operating in. Okay. So I'm going to leave our first calculation behind, and I'm going to show you something else in FileMaker that's called the data viewer. The data viewer allows us to, it's only in FileMaker Advanced, and it's here under the Tools menu. It's called, and there we see data viewer. And what the data viewer allows us to do is view the results of calculations without actually creating a calculation field. We can use this for testing purposes, debugging purposes, that sort of thing. And there are two basic windows here. One's called current and the other's called watch. The current window is actually for the current running script. So if you're running through a script and you have calculations that are occurring within the script, maybe you're setting variables, maybe you're setting values in fields places, different things along those lines, those will all show up in a list here. In addition to that, we have in FileMaker something called variables. And there are two types of variables. And I'm going to explain them to you now really quickly and explain what they are. There are three types of variables. There are, a variable, first of all, is just a place to store data temporarily. So you can, if you wanted to, say, suppose you're in a database that is used for creating quotes, and you want to leave the table that you're currently on, go to another table and create a record and put a key value in that other record and then come back to the table that you were first on. Well, how could you store that key value when you're in this area and then using your script to go to a different part of the database, to another table, and enter new data in there? Well, you can do it by creating something called a variable. A variable is, as I said, just like a container. It allows you to take a value out of a field, hold it like you're putting it on a shelf somewhere, go to another table, and then grab that off the shelf and put the value in where you need it, and then you can continue moving on with your script. That's called a script variable, and script variables are of two types. There's a type that only lasts for the life of the script, and it starts with a single $sign. And there's a type of variable that persists across scripts. It lives forever until you clear it out, and that's called a global variable, and that is available across your file. And that just is defined with two $signs. I'm going to come back to that and show you an example of that in a little while. But the data viewer shows you, in addition to what's happening in the currently running script, it shows you any global variables that are still defined. And if there's a value in them, the value in this one is a space, which is hard to see. But if there's a value in them, FileMaker will show you what that value is. There's another type. In the data viewer, there's another area. It's called watch. And this is where it allows you to come in and create calculations that you just want to fool around with, try out, test out, or maybe refer to again and again. Like, where's my window position right now? The top and the left. What's my window height? What's my window width? Can create all kinds of different calculations in here. So I'm just going to go down to the bottom. I'm going to click the plus button. And I get the calculation window again. But instead of the result going into a field, now my result will show up down in the results window down below. So if I type in 10, FileMaker is going to show me 10. If I make that into a text constant, 10, FileMaker is still going to show me 10. If I type in Bob, FileMaker is going to say, there's no Bob, because remember, it thinks that it's trying to find a field named Bob. There's no table that contains a field that's named Bob. It doesn't make sense to it. So, but if I put it into quotes, then we can see the result come in down at the bottom. So it's just like the window that we were just looking at. It's always evaluating, though, based on the context of the current layout, the layout that's behind the layout that we're currently on. And so I'm going to use this window to show you a couple more examples. First of all, important thing about FileMaker's calculation engine is that it defaults to Boolean. So if I put an expression in here like 5 is greater than 6, it shows me a result down here of 0. 0 is the Boolean value for false. It's not true. If I put in here 7 is greater than 6, it returns a 1. Which means true. If I enter a word in here, which is true, FileMaker interprets that as a Boolean value for true. It's one of the cases where you can, it's the only other case I can think of right now where you can enter a word and not have FileMaker say, hey, I can't find that, that's not the name of a field. So you can enter true, and you can also enter false. And it returns the Boolean value. Boolean logic, by the way, is just logic that's based on true and false. And it evaluates to a 1 for true and a 0 for false. So this window that we're looking at right now, it accepts values that are fields, numbers, literal text, as we've said. And I'm just going to show you a couple of things having to do with the way that other values are stored. First of all, in FileMaker, time is stored as the number of seconds since midnight. So there's a function called time, and it's asking me for hours, minutes, and seconds, and it's going to return to me time as though it were hours on a clock. I can use I can show get current time, and FileMaker is going to show me the current time right down here at the bottom. Now, because FileMaker is storing time as the number of seconds since midnight, I can add and subtract and perform mathematical operations on this. So I can say get current time plus say 3600, that's the number of seconds in an hour, and it's going to show us the time 1 hour from now. Similarly, I could be using get timestamp, and the results for timestamp show the date along with the time, and FileMaker saves timestamp data as the number of seconds since January 1st, 0001. So that means I can add seconds to this and perform mathematical operations. So if I add, I wrote it down here so I wouldn't forget, 12 hours is 43,200 seconds. So if I put in here 43,200, then it should give me a result, yep, of 12 hours from now down here. So knowing the way that these things are stored, allows you to perform calculations with them and manipulate them. I'm going to show you one last thing. I told you earlier that data is entered as Unicode. Unicode is just a way of creating a code for every letter in the alphabet, every character that it's possible to type on the keyboard, in fact, so it goes far beyond letters. Uppercase and lowercase have different values, so A does not have the same value as lowercase a, like this. FileMaker allows us to extract that Unicode, so I could type in here there's a function called code, and it's looking for text. Well, I'm going to put an A in there, and if I just put an A in there like that, FileMaker doesn't know what the heck I just did, right? So I have to say, okay, that's logical, or that's rather a constant value, and it shows me down here that the Unicode value for that is 65. Well, because it's returning a number, 65, I could add a number to that and get 66. Well, if I wanted to find out, well, what's the Unicode character for 66? Well, there's another function that I can use, which is called char, C-H-A-R, and it's looking for a number. So I'm going to take this, which is returning a number, I'm going to stick it in, and lo and behold, now I'm able to display the letter B. And if I keep changing my number here, C, D, E, et cetera, I'm showing you this not because you're going to be using this all the time. I'm showing this so that you understand how FileMaker is storing these values underneath and getting a sense of what's possible. Okay. Now we're going to move on to some much more exciting stuff. We're going to do a quick tour of FileMaker via the calculation engine. And I'm going to start right here by saying that in addition to using calculations in the calculation window like we just were for defining fields, we can also manipulate all sorts of things within our FileMaker environment using calculations. So I'm going to just go up here to View. I'm going to switch into Layout mode. From now on, I'm going to use Command-L to do that. And I'm going to show you some really interesting things that you can do. We can, for instance, we can control the visibility of objects within FileMaker by using a calculation. For instance, I'm going to select this whole group of text right here. And I'm going to bring up FileMaker's inspector, which is where we can control objects on our layout. And you can see right here, under the data area, we've got a way to hide objects when. And we can click on this little button and get our calculation window. And now we can put some logic, business logic, into our solution. We can say, I'm going to use a function that's called left. Now, left is looking for some text, and it allows us to specify how many letters, counting from the left, how many letters we're going to return. So I'm going to say, in my customer name, return the first character, and if that character equals the letter E, then FileMaker is going to hide the objects that I've selected and that I've applied that to. So let's take a look at this. So the first company here is Exoteric, and that hid them. When we go to ABC Inc., we can see they're displayed again. So we're conditionally showing and hiding. And by the way, the button that was there can't be clicked on. It's really hidden from the user's ability to, the user has no way of interacting with it. We can do that just with a calculation. Now, it's probably not that useful to use a calculation to display and hide things based on whether the first letter in their name starts with E, but you could be using this to say, all right, if somebody's logged in with the salesperson privilege set, don't allow them to see what the cost is. You could be hiding the cost field, for instance. So different ways in which you could be hiding. This is extremely useful calculation. Any questions? No? OK, going to keep rolling. Another thing that we can do is we can construct a tooltip. Suppose that, so I'm going to select a button here. I've got a button that's pointing at my company number. And that, when you click on that button, it actually allows you to look up a new company number if you had entered the wrong one by mistake. So I'm going to put a tooltip on there. And I'm going to say, oops, sorry. I'm going to go in the tooltip area. And I'm going to open the calculation window. And I'm going to make a calculation that looks like this. I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to look at my company number. So see my company number right here, which is in my environment. So I'm going to say, well, I'm going to use a statement called a case statement. Let's just look at that. Case says, perform a test, and depending on the result of that test, return a result. And so my test is going to say, if the company number is empty, then say, click on this button to add a new company. But if it's got a value in it, I'm going to say, click on this button to change the company. So I need to plug this in here. And FileMaker's helping us by showing us what parameters we want to add. And this is a little bit confusing. So I'm going to spend a minute and show you how to read this window. First of all, FileMaker wants to perform a test. Our test is going to be, is this empty or not? And then it's going to return a result. Our result is going to be some literal text, like if it's empty, then return, click the button to add a company number. Well, case allows us to perform multiple tests. And FileMaker will continue to perform tests until it reaches one that's true. And when it's true, it will return the result. So the way that you read this window is everything inside of these curly brackets is optional. So all we need for sure is just this in order for this function to work. But if we want to have multiple tests, then we can put in another semicolon and have a second test and a result for the second test. Let's do that right now. I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm going to take all of this out of here, and I'm going to create my test. I'm going to say case. We've got another function here that's called not, or rather an operator called not. We've got a function called isEmpty. IsEmpty says, is the value empty? If the value is empty, then return true. Well, I'm saying if it's not the case that it's empty, so in other words, if it does have a value in it, then say, click to change company. Now, I'm going to show you something about how we can arrange text inside of this window. We don't have to type our text in a long, long string that becomes difficult to read. In this case, we're going to have multiple tests. And so I'm going to put them on top of each other like this. And my second test is going to say, is empty. So if it turns out to be the case that this is empty, oops, that field is empty, then to add a new company. I'm going to close it off like that. FileMaker ignores all these spaces. So it allows us to arrange our calculation in a way that's easy to read. We might want to put our closing bracket down at the bottom like this. So now we're looking at, here's our first test. If it's not empty, if it's not the case that it's empty, show us this result. If it is the case that it's empty, then show us that result. And then we have to close our brackets. Otherwise, if we don't, FileMaker doesn't know where to stop reading, and it's going to give us a message that says, there are more closing brackets than opening brackets, or more opening brackets than closing brackets, FileMaker doesn't know how to handle it. So we have to make sure that our calculation is properly balanced with brackets. Once we've done that, now we've got a tooltip on here, and let's take a look at it. So I'm going to just zoom in. I'm going to hover, and it says click to change company. That's because there's a value in there. If I take the value out of there, now it's going to say click to add a new company, because there's no company in there. So that's the case, using the case function, one of the most important functions in FileMaker, and combining that with the tooltip to make things a little bit easier on your end users when they're trying to figure out how to work certain things. You might want to make this more discoverable by putting a question mark there or something like that, so they know that, oh, things that have question marks, you can click and drag over to get a tooltip, for instance. OK, any questions? Yes? Good question. Let's go on to my very next example. OK. Another thing that we can do is we can conditionally format fields. So I'm going to go, I'm going to go back into layout mode. We're going to look at this salesperson field right here. And I'm going to right-click on it. It brings up a menu that allows me to conditionally format that field. And I can go in and, let me just start from scratch here. I can go in and I can create a formula using the calculation window. FileMaker tries to help you out. I don't know why, because it's almost never what you need that pops up in that window. But you just clear it out, and then you open up specify, and we're going to enter a formula now. And we're going to say that we can start typing and get to the field that we're looking for. Also, if we've got a really long list, we can type in here, and it will just narrow that list down to the field that we're looking for, give us matches. So we're going to say salesperson. That's the field that we're going to operate on. And we're going to say, notice that I put these things together by putting in chunks and pieces. I've got the field that I want to be looking at right now in my conditional formatting. And I'm going to say that is empty. So in other words, if, and I'm going to stick my field in there, if that field is empty, then do something. Well, I'm going to tell it to format with this yellow color that I picked out earlier. So now we can see that the text, that it's yellow. So we could be using this to show these are the required fields. You absolutely have to have values in these fields. And then if we choose someone and stick them in there, we can see the formatting goes away because it's no longer empty. Let's see, what else do we have here? Well, one other thing. There's one other type that we can put in here. And that's, we've got a field here called terms. And we might want to put some text in there that's giving an instruction to the user. So I'm going to open up my inspector again. And this time, I'm going to go to right here where we can enter placeholder text for when a field is empty. We can show a value in there when the field is empty. So we could say, we could do something like this. We could say case, company name, customer name, equals exoteric Inc. That's not going to work, though, because we have to make it literal text. Then show this value, show no terms available. And otherwise, and by the way, with the case statement, available, with the case statement, remember we could have another test at the end, but we don't have to. We can put in a default value. So if this does not evaluate to true, instead of displaying that, which we won't be showing because it's not true, we are going to tell it to show us another value. I'm still not spelling it right? Like this, select terms. Okay, available God love me. Thank you. So we can see here, when we're on exoteric ink, it's showing us no terms are available. This is just placeholder text that we can type over top of that. And as soon as we put something in, that goes away. But if I go to another client, another customer, now we can see it tells us to select our terms. So placeholder text can be useful. There are times where you don't want to show a field name. It doesn't make sense to show a field name, but you want to give a prompt to the end user. So that's where you would use placeholder text, for instance. Well, there are all kinds of other places where we can use calculations within FileMaker. And I'm going to show you one other example here and explain to you some of the power of calculations when we're working across records. I'm just going to perform a find for contact 10003. I happen to know that that's my contact number and that I've got 5 quotes in here. So we can go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we can look at those different quotes. Well, turns out I'm just going to flip through with the keyboard, so you're not going to be able to see me clicking, but I'm going to flip through these quotes. You look at my phone number down here, 416 44444. There's a different phone number for me there. Maybe we wanted one phone number for one quote and another one, because for this most recent quote, I said, oh, make sure you call me on my cell because I'm not going to be, I'm out of town for a week or whatever it is. But here's my normal phone number. And then we've got some that don't have a phone number in at all. Well, how can we remedy this? Well, first of all, I'm just going to go and look in the quote area of my database. Oops. Going to go and look in the quote area of, or rather in the company area of my database, and I'm going to find my company and see that, yep, I do have a cell phone number that's entered in here down at the bottom. So we know there's a value in there. But I want that value to go in just the fields that don't have values in them right now. How can I do that? How can I now pull that data over? Well, it turns out that I have a relationship between the quote and the contact that's based on my contact number. And I can use a function that FileMaker has, or an ability that FileMaker has, to replace field contents with the calculation. So I'm going to choose, so what I've done is I've clicked in my phone field. I'm going to choose replace field contents. And now this is going to replace the field contents in all 5 records that I just found. Remember, the first 2 records had phone numbers that I want to preserve. But I'm going to, with confidence, but with caution, click down here at the bottom where it says replace with calculated result. And my calculated result is going to be looking into my related quote lines. I just happen to know I created a convention, so I know QOT stands for quote, QLN stands for quote lines. So I'm going to be looking into my quote lines, or rather, sorry, my contact lines, CON for contact, and I'm going to find the cell phone number, and I'm going to replace with that cell phone number. Now, if I did that, it would put the same phone number in every single field. Remember, my first field was a different number because I wanted to have a special number while I was on vacation or whatever it was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a calculation that allows me to handle this problem. I'm going to say case is empty. Notice this empty comes up a lot, is used a lot. If that value is, if the cell phone number, if in my current table the cell phone number is empty, then use the related cell phone number, bring that in and stick that into the field. But if it's not empty, then use whatever I've currently got in there as the contact cell phone number. So this is going to run through and it's going to say, is there a value in there? Yep. Then just replace it with the value it's already got. Is there no value in there? OK, then go and get that related data and stick it in. It's looking that value up from the related record, and it's writing it into the field in the record that we're currently on. So I'm pulling it in from a related value. And there it is. And if we flip through them, There we go. My first phone number was preserved because I said if there's a value in there, just return that value again. Otherwise. So that's a little trick. Another thing we could have done, of course, is just found the records that were empty and done our replace that way. It's a little bit safer. Replace field contents can be a little bit dangerous. OK, we're in the home stretch. FileMaker security is, if we go up here to File and choose Manage and Security, and we go into our privilege sets, you can define privilege sets for different people within your organization, and then you can set up custom privilege sets, so custom privileges. So we're going to the sales privilege set right now. We're clicking on custom privileges. We can control who can view records based on a calculation. In this case, we're saying if the value in a field called account creator that gets auto-entered, by the way, when we create a new record with the name of the current account that's logged in, if that equals the account that's logged in right now, then show the record. Otherwise, you won't be able to see this record. So we can make it so that only the person who created the record can see the record, for instance. All sorts of ways in which we can control our security schema through FileMaker calculations. I'm just going to mention it because that's a whole world in itself to get into. I think the biggest area in which FileMaker uses calculations are scripts. And I'm going to show you really quickly a script. And then I'm going to show you really quickly one final thing about calculations. So if we get to 11:30, don't pack up and think I'm going to wrap up right away. I'm probably going to go to 11:35. Okay, you're free to leave on your own recognizance. But if you would like to stay, I would like for you to stay. So I'm going to show you a couple more things. First of all, we've got a script in this database that allows us to just click and add a new line. See, it added a new line down here. I'll click again. It's adding a new line. Let's just take a look at the way this script works and show an example of calculations working in scripts to give you a sense of what you can do, what's possible. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into layout mode. I can double click on that script and just see, what did I call it? What's the name of that script? Well, it's called Create New Quote Line. So I'm going to go up here to my script menu. And I can start typing now in here, create new, have to spell correctly. And there it is, create new quote line. Now, let's look at this quote for a second. The very first thing we do in this quote is, remember I said we could set variables that are like containers for holding a value? Well, here's a variable, a script variable, that's prefixed by a $sign. FileMaker helps you out here and tells you right across the top how this works. If it's got the name has a single $sign, then it's a local variable. A local variable means it's local to the current script, and the container that we're creating to hold a value only lasts while that script is running. As soon as we get to the last step in that script, that value goes away, that container goes away, that's no longer around. If we put $signs in here, we're creating a value that persists beyond the life of the script. Okay? So what we're doing, though, is we're creating a value, or we're holding a value in a variable using the calculation engine. So we're going in here, and rather, we're not performing any kind of complex calculation with a formula, but we're just saying, just give us this value, the value of our quote number, and stick that in. So we're grabbing our quote number, we're putting it in a variable. Now look at the next thing we're doing. We're going to a layout. We're going to a different layout, so in a different part of the database. We're creating a new record, and we're setting a field within that record, and we're setting that field, the set field script step, actually asks us what field we want to set, which is our quote number field in the quote line table. And it's asking us, well, what's our result? We can see here, our result is the quote number. Notice up at the top, though, it says this calculation will be evaluated based on context determined at runtime. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to answer that question in just about the next 7 minutes. I'm going to close this down. I'm going to show you another very similar problem. Here we've got some line items. I'm going to flip to a different one. Here we've got some line items, and just give me one sec. Now, we've got line items in this quote, and down at the bottom, whoops, down at the bottom, sorry. Down at the bottom, we've got a subtotal. Just going to show you that. And what we want to be able to do is we want FileMaker to take the values that we've got here for each of our lines and be able to sum them, and at the bottom give us a subtotal. Now, in order to do that, we have to create a calculation in the current record, the quote record, that's looking through to the line items that we've got here in some related quote lines. So let's just look at that. Let's create that calculation. So I'm going in here, F subtotal. And the very beginning of our calculation window, it says, evaluate this calculation from the context of. Remember, a minute ago, when we were looking at our script, it said the context would be evaluated during runtime. What is this context that's being referred to? What are they talking about? What's runtime mean? Well, runtime in the script world just means when the script is running, it's going to evaluate, it's going to determine the value of the field based on, or the value of the calculation based on its context. Well, what does context mean? What does context right here mean? Well, when we click on this drop down, or in this case it's dropping up, when we click on it, it shows us a bunch of different table occurrences on our table occurrence graph. We need to know which one of these to use for the current calculation. We have no way of determining this. No matter how long you've been in the FileMaker world, we don't know how to determine which one of these to use unless we do a little investigating. So let's do a little investigation. For this, I'm going to tell you a couple of things about FileMaker's relational structure. Or rather, its organizational structure. Here's how FileMaker files are put together. You might have seen this slide yesterday, but I need to refresh you in order to really answer this question. So we start off with a file. On top of the file, we have tables. Within the tables, we have fields. That's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is to say that we start with a file. Inside the file, there are tables. And on top of the tables are table occurrences. So these are references back to the table. These are the things that show up on our relationship graph. And then on top of our table occurrences, we have our layouts and our scripts and our calculations. So all of our layouts are sitting on top of table occurrences on our relationship graph, and our table occurrences on the relationship graph refer back to tables. And what FileMaker means by context is knowing where you are in the database, meaning which layout are you on. And when you know which layout you're on, you know which table occurrence that layout's based on, and then you know which table that table occurrence is connected to. So I'm going to show you something quickly in FileMaker to finish this off and to answer the question. So what we want to do to determine how we're going to construct this calculation. So we're going to go into layout mode, and I'm going to just right-click on the layout, to bring up the layout setup window. And I need to see what table occurrence the current layout that I'm sitting on rests on top of. And so there's a table occurrence called QOT, and that is just my short form for quote. So now we know what layout we're sitting on. Every layout is sitting on a table occurrence. Let's go look at that table occurrence in the relationship graph. So that means my layout is right here. I'm sitting on this layout right now. So when you're thinking about layouts, you should be thinking about what table occurrence rather that layout is connected to. And when we're sitting on top of this layout, it's like we're sitting on top of a mountain. And from the mountain, here are the different related records that we can see. This is the data that we have access to. So I'm currently on a layout here, and I'm looking out over all of this. Now, I need to know what lines I need to summarize. We know that my context is the QOT table. From the QOT table, I've got those line items. Let's look at them for a second. We've got these line items, and we can see right down here what table occurrence this portal is based on. So we can see what table occurrence our line items are based on. It's QOT underscore QLN. So that's from quote to quote line based on our quote number. That's what we're using for our relationship. That's just a convention that are created to be able to name my table occurrences. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to say, OK, we're sitting here, and we're looking for quote underscore QLN. Well, there it is. So from this context, I want to sum a value that's in this table occurrence. Let's do that right now. So we're going to go back into our fields. We're going to go back into our subtotal. Now we know how to answer this question. Evaluate this calculation from the context of quote, because that's the layout that we're sitting on right now. And from quote, what can we see? From that mountain, what can we see? Well, here's the list of related records that we can see. And which one do we want? We want the one that's quote underscore QLN, so from quote to quote line based on the quote number. And so now we've got a list of related fields. One of our fields is called extended. Extended is the finance way of saying take your quantity times your price and show the results. So in our line item, we've got a quantity like 3 times our price of 10 gives us an extended of 30. So we're going to take that. If I just showed this in my calculation, I would only be showing, I wouldn't be summing all of the line items in my quote. So what I want to do is I want to use a function called sum. And it takes the value of a field. There's the field that I'm going to put in. It's a related field. And now we're summing related records, records from a related table. And there we go. And we arrive at our subtotal. So in order for calculations to work, in order for you to be successful in FileMaker, you have to be thinking about where you are on the relationship graph. And you do that by knowing what layout you're sitting on and what table occurrence that layout is sitting on in the relationship graph. Let me just show you that one last time. I'm going to go into layout mode. I'm going to go to I'm going to right-click on the layout, go to Layout Setout. Now, here's a list of all the table occurrences that are currently on my relationship graph. They're all here. When I pick one, as soon as I pick one, I'm now sitting on a certain spot on that graph. And from that certain spot, I've got all the things that I can see. Any questions about that? OK, I think that's all we have time for today. There's a little bit more in my slides than what I was able to get to today. So there's a little more in there for you in the slides. Please fill out your session evaluations, and thank you very much for coming.